Okay. All right, good evening, everybody. My name's Justine Bell-James from the University of Queensland Law School. Very sorry I can't be there in person in the beautiful Whitsundays. I'd very much like to be there. So hopefully I can join you again next time we have one of these meetings. So what I'm going to talk to you about this evening, I'm sharing my recording now, is the new blue carbon methodology, which I've been involved in developing. All right, so just very briefly, for those of you that aren't familiar with the term blue carbon, it is a generic term that refers to the carbon that's sequestered in the biomass and the soils, so both the leaves and the soils of vegetated coastal ecosystems, such as mangroves, seagrass, and salt marsh. Coastal ecosystems like these three that I've just mentioned provide a really effective long-term and stable carbon sink in comparison even to terrestrial vegetation. And the other benefit that they have over terrestrial forests and land-based forests is that their carbon storage capacity can increase over time. So soils accrete over time, so the soils build up, and this allows them to store more carbon over time, compared with your land-based vegetation sinks, which become saturated. So there are some real benefits to investing in these sorts of ecosystems as a carbon project, because they do have the potential to grow over time. So because of this, there's been significant work over the past decade to decade and a half considering how to integrate blue carbon into carbon crediting frameworks. So initially, science has been the holdup here. So it took a while before scientists could accurately measure or model the amount of carbon that was stored by these ecosystems and also how it would change over time. But this is something that has evolved quite a bit over the past decade, and the science is now very established, and it is very much possible to model in particular the carbon. So I've been involved with blue carbon from the legal side for quite some time now, and what's been really interesting from my perspective is that there are a number of really sticky legal issues involved with operationalising these projects. And one of the big ones is the fact that coastal wetlands occupy the intertidal zone. So if you look at my little diagram here, these are your, I guess, legal boundaries here, and these are the sort of boundaries that coastal scientists, for example, speak of. And these are your coastal wetlands here. So they occupy this intertidal zone, which is where land and water meet. And what's interesting about this zone from a legal perspective is that this is generally also the boundary between ownership regimes, if the landward parcel is held in, for example, freehold or leasehold tenure. So there's this intersection here, and you might have the wetland occurring across both sides of the boundary. This also means it's often uncertain as to who owns the wetland and therefore who would have the entitlement to any carbon stored therein. And it also creates uncertainty as to who can undertake restoration work. So if somebody wants to go ahead with a restoration project to get carbon credits, who would actually have the entitlement to do it? And then there's all sorts of flow-on issues as well, such as what permits would be required. Are you looking for public land permits, private land permits, both, for example? So a lot of my work has been looking at how to resolve these issues. We've made a lot of progress though, and the work that I've done has found that there are certainly ways that you can get around these legal issues. So once it was clear that the science was established enough to go ahead and the legal issues could be overcome, the next thing that had to be considered was how to incorporate blue carbon into Australia's emissions reduction framework, which is our main climate change policy at the federal level. So for a project to be eligible for credits under the ERF, there are a few things that must happen. And the first is that there needs to be a methodology determination for that type of project. So there needs to be something that's been made that gives guidance to proponents as to how they need to go ahead and do the project and how they need to demonstrate carbon abatement. So you need that methodology determination. And a project would also need to satisfy all of the usual criteria under the emissions reduction fund, such as additionality. So it needs to be something that occurs over and above the status quo. So for example, a person can't just say, I've got mangroves on my land, therefore I'm storing carbon and therefore I want credits. There would need to be some sort of activity occurring to generate additional abatement. So there are lots of different activities that you could do in relation to coastal wetlands to increase carbon storage capacity. So the choice was made to focus on just one for this first methodology, which is tidal restoration of blue carbon ecosystems. So in Queensland in particular, there are lots of these ponded pastures like on the screen, so areas where bund walls have been constructed often many, many decades ago when they're actually encouraged by the government to remove tidal influence and create green pasture for cattle grazing. So it creates this area of land that gets really saturated during the wet season. So during the dry season, you're left with some green land for cattle grazing. But if these bund walls are removed, then tidal influence is reinstated and coastal wetlands can re-establish. So that gives you that criteria of additionality there. It is something over and above the status quo. So this was what was decided to be the approach for the first blue carbon methodology under Australia's Emissions Reduction Fund. And the method finally came into effect of January of this year, which was very exciting. It was quite a long time coming. So proponents of these types of restoration projects can now apply for accreditation and get credits once the abatement occurs. So lots of restoration is being considered now, particularly in Queensland, but in other places as well. And certainly the work that I'm doing at the moment has really shifted from looking at how those legal issues can be dealt with theoretically to now how they can work in practice. And certainly the same for my science colleagues as well. They're now on the ground finding project sites, and we're trying to figure out which ones are the best sites from a biophysical perspective, but also in terms of which has the easiest tenure regime and lots of other things as well. So it's a really exciting space at the moment. There's still a lot of work to do in this space, and one of the big issues that I'm looking at quite a bit at the moment is how to deal with the inland migration of coastal wetlands. So again, as I'm sure a lot of you know, as sea levels rise, the intertidal zone will move inland. And wetlands have the physical ability to also move inland, provided that there are no physical barriers to them doing so, such as fences or seawalls, etc. So it's obviously easy for this to be facilitated in undeveloped areas or areas that are in public ownership, such as reserves, because you just zone it as land for future migration and leave it development free. And that's an approach they're starting to take in some other Australian jurisdictions. But it's much harder in developed areas and also areas in private ownership due to presumptions against retrospectivity and also due to uncertainties about when the land will be needed. So I've been working with some colleagues from the Nature Conservancy to see if we can use what we've termed rolling covenants based on a concept called rolling easements from the United States to facilitate migration. So what this concept involves is incentives. You're going to need to be looking at incentives to get landholders to change land use in these circumstances. But rather than looking at purchasing land now or asking them to give up land now, we tried to see if we could find a balance between allowing landholders and farmers to use land productively in the short to medium term with the requirement that they will not physically obstruct coastal wetlands from moving inland over time. So the idea is that over time, gradually, that productive land use will move back into the landward part of the block so that they can use the land in the short to medium term. So we've looked at legal instruments that can be put into place to facilitate these sorts of mechanisms. So anyway, there's lots of interesting stuff happening, and this is just a really quick overview of it. And I hope that I can come back to discuss these in person with you one day soon. So thank you very much and have a good evening.